From a string of suspicious murders in 1960s Alabama, to the mysteries of one of the biggest explosions in the universe, to the unknown cause of one of the most deadly mass extinction events to affect planet Earth. These are just a few of the many unsolved mysteries we'll be exploring this week. So without further ado, grab a drink, my choice today is English tea, and join me as we explore the unsolved mystery Iceberg. So to start off with, we have the Maine Penny. This was a Norwegian coin found in Maine, United States, 1957. It dates back to the reign of Olaf Kyrre, the king of Norway in the 11th century, which proves to some that the Viking people came to North America, specifically this far south, long before Columbus did, and potentially and likely engaged in trade with the local people. The silver coin was apparently found in 1957 on an old Native American settlement, along with roughly 30,000 other items, and it was donated to the Maine State Museum in 1974. The Marfa Lights, also known as the Marfa Ghost Lights, are these mysterious lights frequently observed near Route 67 in Texas. People have attributed these lights to ghosts, aliens, spiritual creatures or beings, stuff like the will-o-wisp, which we explored in a previous episode, and the lights are described as distant spots of brightness that are not apparently attributable to headlights or ranch lights. These were first spotted in 1883, and still to this day there are multiple sightings each and every year. Mary Agnes Gross was a strange, disturbing case of a baby who went missing in 1962 Minnesota. A 20-year-old Marlis Thomas was pregnant and going into labor. She was quite heavily sedated, as it wasn't the smoothest of labors, shall we say, and Marlis remembers waking up seeing her daughter Mary Agnes Gross for the first time. She apparently saw the baby moving, and then she passed out. When she woke up, she was alone in the room with the nurse, and when she asked to see her child, Mary, she was told that Mary had been alive for about an hour and then had tragically died. And when she was discharged and leaving the hospital, she actually asked to see Mary, and when they showed her Mary, she remembers later on thinking that Mary didn't look dead. She looked to be maybe sleeping or something. But at the time, Marilis didn't question it, and so she didn't press any further. Now, things in this one get very strange very quickly. When Marilis and her friend attended Mary's funeral, Marilis noticed that the baby that was in the casket looked in many ways different to the baby that they had shown her in the hospital. She had a different hair color and length, and she had a few different marks on her body. And when Marilis's mother, Clara, tried to take a photograph of the baby, the funeral director wouldn't allow it. So come the day of the burial, another completely bizarre thing happened, and that was the presence of another family at the burial site at the exact same time, apparently mourning the death of another child. And later on, Marilis went back to the gravesite and noticed a completely different child's name on the gravestone, Pamela Ray Dickey. And when she questioned this, the cemetery confirmed to her that there was no records of Mary Agnes being buried on that day. The plot thickens. There was only a record of one funeral that day and one burial, Pamela Ray. Pamela had died only a few hours before Mary's supposed death, on the same day in the same hospital. And hospital records said that Mary was alive and well at birth, with a normal heart rate and normal color. But the death certificate said that she was dead on arrival, and that she had never even drawn her first breath, even though Marilis swore she saw her child moving and breathing. On top of all this, she had her death marked down as 6:20 p.m., 3 minutes before her birth at 6:23 p.m. So with all of these suspicious discrepancies going on, Marilis started to suspect that Mary didn't in fact die, and was still alive somewhere out there. She had Mary's grave exhumed, and DNA tests proved that the body that was buried there wasn't Mary's and wasn't even Pamela's, but belonged to a third unidentified baby girl. And whilst all this madness and mayhem was going on, Marilis received a photograph in the mail. There was no letter, no return address, no discernible identification, and no trace of who or where it came from. The photo was of a husband, a wife, 2 children, and 1 baby girl. The baby girl apparently looked like Mary's father, but Marlis didn't recognize anyone else in the photograph. So kind of a wild case, but theories suggest that Mary was actually taken by the hospital for some reason, and Marlis was told that Mary had died, and she had the funeral and burial, etc. There are some who accuse the hospital of human trafficking, and Marlis believes that because she was young and living alone, the hospital decided to take Mary from her and give her to a more responsible family, which is absolutely twisted if that is true. And the photograph that Marlis received could very well be someone taking pity on her, letting her know that yes, while you lost your child, she's still alive and safe and happy somewhere out there. Marlis died in 2012, never finding out the truth, but her children still believe that their sister is out there somewhere and are still seeking answers behind her birth and supposed death. Megan Curl was a 26-year-old worker at a chicken processing plant in Texas. She had mild learning difficulties and was apparently quite naive and constantly longed for attention. On March 25th, 2000, she was out at a local nightclub called the Electric Cowboy, where she was eventually asked to leave because of her provocative dancing, and witnesses saw her with an unidentified male who had apparently bought her 2 drinks. Megan then went home, and she and her neighbor and best friend, Tonya, were stood out on Tonia's balcony talking about the night and how it went, when suddenly a car came speeding down the road and came to a screeching halt just outside Megan's house. Megan said it was probably the guy from the club, and so she went down to speak with him. Tonya went back inside, and when she came out to check on Megan, she and the man from the club were both inside the car, apparently talking. Tonya again went inside, and when she came out to check later, the car was still there, but Megan and the man weren't. So she went to Megan's apartment to check on her, and she saw that the man from the car and club were in there with her. She said he was a friend from the club and that she was okay, and Tonya even double checked if she was okay, and Megan said that she was. So Tonya said goodnight and went back to her apartment. This was the last time that anyone would see Megan alive. At around 4 a.m, the fire department was called to Megan's house, and when they entered her apartment, her bedroom, but mainly her bed, had been set on fire. Megan's charred body was found tied to the bed, completely beyond recognition, with her throat slit multiple times, and a plastic bag placed over her head. The authorities in the end were only able to identify her with dental records. Authorities suspected that she was killed by someone she knew, and so naturally all of her exes and family were questioned, including an ex who had actually just gotten out of prison that week, but apparently he had quite a solid alibi. The main suspect to this day is this guy, who is the man from the car and the club. He has yet to be identified, and so this remains an unsolved case. Rochelle Robinson and Michael Johnston, aged 19 and 25, were 2 friends who were found horrifically murdered in 1994, Washington. They were both avid fans and players of Magic the Gathering, which is a fantasy card game, and after playing together one night at a friend's house, they left the friend's house in separate cars. Now, one important thing that came up in the case was that these 2 friends were in fact secret lovers and were having an affair, as Michael was actually married with 2 kids at the time. Police believe that after leaving the friend's house, Michael parked his car up somewhere and Rochelle picked him up sometime after 1 a.m. Then they parked on a quiet road dubbed by many in the area as Lover's Lane. They were completely alone for a while, engaging in coitus, when someone suddenly appeared, opened the back door, and found the pair having sex. They were apparently forced to dress quite quickly, as when Rochelle was found, she was wearing Michael's t-shirt inside out. Police believe that they were forced out of the car, likely at gunpoint. Michael was handcuffed and forced to kneel near the car, then shot, then had his throat slit, all in front of Rochelle. Rochelle then was likely held at knife point, as she had several shallow knife marks on her neck, and she was forced into the killer's car while he drove them to a remote road. He only drove for about 5 miles before stabbing her to death, slitting her throat, and leaving her on the side of the road covered in just a cardboard box. Some people believe that the killings were linked to dark occult activities because the pair there were Magic the Gathering players, which is such a 1980s thing to say, even though this wasn't the 1980s. Ex-lovers and family members were all investigated and eventually cleared, including Michael's wife and now widow, Janet. Rochelle did have some problems with a stalker who would often show up to her work and just watch her until she left. Her colleagues actually had to, on several occasions, ask the man to leave, and Rochelle said that she was worried that he might do something. So to me, this guy seems like the most likely suspect, as he may very well have been obsessed with Rochelle and was jealous over her relationship with Michael. But he was never identified, and so to this day, these two murders remain a mystery. Missing Nazis' gold. So during the reign of the Nazis in Germany, they stole, looted, and accumulated billions of dollars in today's money worth of gold. They held this gold in various stores and banks around the world, with the Swiss National Bank being a major holder of this gold. Some of this gold was used to finance the war, but the amount they spent versus the amount they had doesn't match up one-to-one, which means there was a ton of excess gold still in storage all around the world. And where a lot of this gold ended up and is today is a little unclear. There have been lawsuits brought and lost against the Vatican Bank, the Franciscan Order, and many others that accuse these parties of holding the Nazi gold just for safekeeping after the war, and then just forgetting about it and eventually keeping it. This accusation is apparently the same for all the banks around the world who held stores of the Nazis' gold. But to this day, even after all of the lawsuits, the whereabouts of a lot of this gold is still unknown. Mngwa is Swahili for strange one, and is a cryptid cat seen in the forests of Tanzania. It is described as a large grey man-eating cat with stripes, and is said to be as big as the biggest of lions, with tracks and markings that resemble a leopard's. And according to some witnesses, it purrs instead of roars, which just makes it adorable. Anything that purrs is automatically cute. There were several reports in the 1900s of merchants and guardsmen being attacked and dying with tufts of grey fur all around the bodies and in the victims' hands. But despite attempts by Africans and Europeans alike, the Mngwa has never been captured. The Morgan County 3 was an absolutely horrific series of 3 killings that all took place in Morgan County, Alabama in the late 1960s. These killings involved 3 women: Mary Faye, Juanita Acker, and Joyce Drake. Now, Mary Faye was a kind, gentle soul working as a secretary in a space flight center, and she volunteered as a pianist in a local church. She went missing while on a 20-minute walk back to her house just before noon on a rainy Saturday in 1967. And soon after she went missing, a search was started. Her search went on along unsuccessfully until months later when her skeletal remains were found in a local fishing area, Wheeler Lake. Her killer was never found, and no major suspects have ever been brought forward. The second woman in this case was Juanita Acker. She was a widowed mother of 3 who had fallen on hard times and was currently living out of a motel with her 2 daughters aged 12 and 16. Both daughters had gone out for the night, and when Susan, her 16-year-old daughter, returned home with her fiancé, the scene they walked in on was, to say traumatizing would be putting it lightly. Her mum, Juanita, was found dead on her now blood-soaked bed, having been shot twice in the face. Police think that someone slipped into the motel room using the spare key that Juanita had left out for her daughters, and the killer just simply shot her in the head while she was sleeping. Nothing in the room was missing. There was no sign of a struggle or evidence that this was a burglary attempt. They interviewed a few key people, but the trail quickly ended, and to this day, Juanita's killer was never found. Our third and final victim, Joyce Drake, was working at her family's general store when she left at around 10:30 a.m. to cash some checks. She was a mother of 2, and her 2 children were with her father. On this morning of January 7th, 1970, she went into the bank alone, but witnesses said they saw a large, big-built, red-headed man in the truck with her after she left. After a while, her parents started to get concerned because she hadn't made it back to the store shore, and soon after this, a search was started. It took all day, but later that evening, Joyce's truck was found abandoned with no sign of Joyce or of the money she withdrew from the bank. A while later, they found the money bag dumped on a nearby road, completely empty save for a single check and a single penny. And later that evening, they found Joyce, or at least what remained of her. She had been dumped on a trash pile in the snow and had been there for several hours. Her throat was slit at least 4 times and was, the sheriff said, the victim of a mad, vicious killer.
A few months ago, we received this letter in the mail. There was no name attached. They wrote asking us to look into the murder of Joyce Drake from 1970. The person also included this stack of newspaper articles about the case. So tonight, WHNT News 19 is shining new light on this cold case, murder in the snow.
There was evidence to show that she had put up a fight, and someone actually came forward to say that they had picked up a hitchhiker, matching the man's description earlier that day. But this didn't really lead anywhere, and the details around it are a little fuzzy. Over the next few years, the investigation into Joyce Drake's murder kind of stopped and started multiple times. And very strangely, decades later, the case files for all 3 women, along with all of the evidence collected, just went missing. They are to this day still unsure about who exactly was responsible for these missing files, as there were multiple agencies and departments working on the cases over the years. But it's still a tragedy that after all of these years, especially now that their case files have gone missing, these 3 women will likely never receive the justice that they deserve. The naked fugitive was an unidentified figure mentioned briefly in the Gospel of Mark immediately after the arrest of Jesus Christ. And there followed him a certain young man, having a linen cloth cast about his naked body. And the young men laid hold on him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. It was not unusual to wear a single body cloth in those days, and these apparently occasionally did just fall off when engaged in sudden active movements like running away. As I said, his identity is still not officially known, but guesses for who he might be over the years range from James the Just, Lazarus of Bethany, Mark himself, the beloved disciple, or just some dude who happened to be there. It was also theorized that the naked fugitive was a metaphor, with the man representing the disciples, the cloth representing Jesus, and the young men representing the Romans. And so, when the Romans captured Jesus, the disciples abandoned Jesus, running off spiritually naked and vulnerable. It's a thought, and it kind of makes sense as a metaphor. But if this was a real account of a real person, his identity to this day remains unknown. The Ogopogo is this giant, dragon-like, snake-like sea creature, or rather lake creature, as it inhabits the Okanagan Lake in British Columbia, Canada. It is described as being a large serpentine creature with smooth, dark skin and a large body up to 50 feet in length. It can move at incredible speeds, coiling its body in vertical undulations, kind of like this. And that is a fantastic way to stretch. The Ogopogo is apparently more closely tied to native myths than any other lake monster, with certain indigenous tribes and peoples originally calling it Naitaka, which is a supremely powerful and evil supernatural entity. Its name can be translated as water demon, water god, sacred creature of the waters, and for hundreds of years the natives would sacrifice small animals, as they believed the Naitaka demanded a live sacrifice for a safe crossing of the lake. The name Ogopogo actually came from an English music hall in 1924. This was in Vernon, British Columbia, and the song says his mother was an earwig, his father was a whale, a little bit of head and hardly any tail, and Ogopogo was his name. The name was apparently first created in 1912, with its nickname being Oggy and some smaller lake creatures being referred to as Ogo pups, which is just adorable. One-Eyed Jack was a man who was killed after accepting a hitchhiking ride in 1978, Idaho. He was originally going to Oregon, but decided to go to Alaska instead, with his, unbeknownst to him at the time, would-be killer. And when they got to Alaska, Jack was stabbed and strangled to death by this man, and his body was dumped in the woods just off the highway. His killer was caught and sentenced to life in prison, and according to the killer, the guy's name was Jack, or John, or something J sounding, and he had only one eye, having lost it in a logging accident. Again, according to the killer, Jack was married, and he washed cars in Colorado or Utah, one of the two, but he said he thought Jack, if that actually was his real name, lied quite a bit, so he wasn't sure if any of the details he told him were even true. And while the killer was caught and identified, Jack never was. And so to this day, who he was and where he came from is still a mystery. The Permian-Triassic extinction event, also known as the Great Dying, which is cheery. This was a massive, severe extinction event that wiped out 57% of biological families, 83% of genera, which is just plural for genus, 81% of marine species, and 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species, which is to say, it wiped out a lot of life. It is also the largest known mass extinction of insects, so at least it did something right. The exact cause of the Great Dying remains unknown, but experts tend to agree that there were multiple waves of it and multiple different causes. Many agree that one of the major causes of the extinction was a series of massive flood basalt volcanic eruptions that created the Siberian traps, which are these huge, I mean, just look at them, huge areas of land made of basalt. Earth's plates apparently had an unusually massive shift, which caused huge pressure and an ungodly amount of lava to spew up from many volcanoes. These volcanic eruptions caused dramatic changes in the environment and temperature, as well as the release of large amounts of toxic and greenhouse gases, inevitably dramatically altering Earth's environment and wiping out a large majority of life on Earth. Many life forms and species went extinct after this, and many more that didn't exist before this event were actually created after everything settled, about 8 or 9 million years later. It was a pretty gnarly event. Scientists don't really know exactly what caused it, whether the volcanic eruptions that caused the Siberian traps were the cause of it, or whether something else like a giant meteor caused both the extinction and the Siberian traps. But it's still a wild topic to look into, and if you have the time and you are interested, I would highly recommend it. The Phaistos Disc was a disc around yay big, made of clay found on the island of Crete. It dates back to between 1800 and 1600 BC, and it is highly unusual as it bears text written in an unknown language and script. The text is written in spirals on the disc and contains 241 occurrences of 45 unique symbols. What it was made for, or even where it was made, we don't know. And although upon its discovery it was thought to be a hoax or forgery, it is now largely accepted to be a genuine artifact. The clay that the disc is made from doesn't seem to be of local origin, not even of Crete origin, and it was found in an underground temple depository that had actually collapsed, likely due to an earthquake, possibly linked to the eruption of the Santorini volcano in the 2nd century BC. And while many attempts to decipher this disc have been made, no one to this date has. And so the mystery of the Phaistos Disc remains a mystery. The Phoenix Lights were a series of strange flying objects spotted in the skies of Arizona and Nevada in 1997. I mean, come on, strange flying objects, Nevada, Arizona. These lights were seen by thousands of people over the course of several hours, with some witnesses describing what appeared to be a giant carpenter's square shaped UFO, with 5 circular lights on it flying overhead. All of these sightings were put down to aircrafts participating in a pilot training program. Sure thing, official statement by the US government, whatever you say. There were many pilots who witnessed the lights and giant craft in the sky, and many of them said that they were well familiar with every type of aircraft, and that this thing was stranger and larger than anything that they had ever seen. Funnily enough, shortly after the incident, the governor of Arizona, Fife Symington III, which is a strange name, which I'm gonna be honest sounds like the name of an alien pretending to be a human, but anyway, he gave a press conference saying that he had caught those who were responsible for the lights, and he brought forward someone dressed in a very silly, very obvious alien costume, which at least he had a sense of humor about it. The Plague of Athens was an epidemic that devastated Athens in ancient Greece in 430 BC. It killed between 75 and 100,000 people, which was roughly a quarter of the population, and was believed to have entered the city through its one and only port. The plague took the life of, among many others, Pericles, who at the time was the leader of Athens. The plague returned twice more in 1429 and 1427. Those who survived the plague became immune, and so they were often the main caretakers for the sick during the next instance of the plague. But people were generally terrified of catching it, and so many people just died alone, and the bodies were left to rot, only being thrown on a pyre to burn weeks later. There was a huge mass grave dug, and nearly 1,000 tombs were dug for various people, and Thucydides' account of what happened during this time describes basically how society completely broke down. The catastrophe was so overwhelming that men, not knowing what would happen to them next, became indifferent to every rule of religion or law. The exact virus or disease responsible for this plague is still unknown, but scientists say that they have narrowed it down to roughly 30 pathogens, including but not limited to the bubonic plague, typhus, smallpox, measles, and even Ebola, which I am super glad that many of these have, for the most part, been eradicated now, which, good job science. Proto Bats. So, bats. Bats. The chickens of the cave, as some people call them. But where did they come from? Well, they pop up in the fossil record about 50 million years ago, and early specimens show that these bats couldn't echolocate, and had to rely on sight, smell, and touch in order to find their food. And from these early bat fossils, the trail just kind of ends. We're not exactly sure where they evolved from, or how fast, or in what time period. All we know is that they are bats. But we have been stumped many times like this in the past, with the origins of whales, birds, and even turtles. We did eventually find all of the missing links for these animals, which has helped map their evolutionary journey, but so far the exact evolutionary origin of bats remains elusive. The Pumina is a cryptid giant snake reported in the Democratic Republic of the Congo near Lake Upemba. It is roughly 38 to 46 feet long, and it resembles an African rock python, only much larger. There were multiple sightings of it over the years, with one Belgian pilot in 1959, Colonel Remy van Leerda, claiming to have seen this giant python while flying over Katanga in the Belgian Congo. He said that he had been flying for 25 years at that point, and he had very good experience for measuring things on the ground. And he said that the snake he saw was very much close to 50 feet, and the snake has not been seen since that day. The Queen's Jane Doe was a teenager, just a girl really, thought to be between the ages of 16 and 19, who was found dead in Queens, New York, 1994. She had on a brown leather jacket, blue jeans, and a pair of black, green, and purple Air Jordans. She was never identified, and her cause of death was never determined. But while researching this one, I typed in Queen's Jane Doe, and just look how many missing people have this name. There are so many unidentified women that have gone missing in Queens, New York alone, which is honestly heartbreaking. But again, big shout out to the Charlie Project. Quark Nova. And we have some lovely space stuff. So neutron stars are the smallest, densest star that we have so far observed in the universe. They are only about 12 miles wide, and they are so dense that a single teaspoon of this star would have a mass of about 1 billion tons. 1 teaspoon! Their crust is made of pure neutrons and is 10 billion times stronger than steel, which is just wow. The only thing more dense in the universe is a black hole, and there was actually an occasion where 2 stars became neutron stars, and they were so close to each other that they ended up pulling each other in, and then the whole thing just collapsed into a black hole, which this stuff just absolutely blows my mind. So neutron stars, smallest, densest stars we know. Right, okay. Got that. So quark stars are hypothetical stars made up entirely of quarks, which is a form of matter smaller than neutrons. It is theorized that when neutron stars are put under enough enough pressure from their own gravity, the individual neutrons that make up the star start to break down into their constituent quarks, forming quark matter. This new star, now made up of quarks, is known as a quark star. But it is once again purely hypothetical, as we have never observed a quark star, but it is thought that when the conversion from a neutron star to a quark star happens, it releases so much energy that it results in one of the largest explosions possible in the universe, and is theorized to be the cause of gamma ray bursts, which are these huge explosions detected in distant galaxies. They are the most energetic, most luminous explosions since the Big Bang, and these bursts can last from 10 milliseconds to several hours. And after the initial burst of gamma rays, an afterglow is emitted at longer wavelengths, such as X-ray, ultraviolet, optical, infrared, microwave, and radio waves. I am just completely in love with this space stuff, so if you'd like to see more space-related mysteries, please do let me know in the comments below, as if enough of you want to see more of them, I can potentially make my own space iceberg of all of the most interesting space-related stuff that I can find, and cover it in a separate video. And that is all we have time for. I really hope you enjoyed this week's episode, guys, and as always, thanks for watching.